Hey everyone, it's Catherine Liggett here, and I'm really excited today to be sharing this topic with you because it's really dear to my heart, the work of anti-racism that we do from within, especially as white people. Um, and just as I wait for people to show up on the live call, I'll just say a couple things. So first of all, if you're listening to this or watching this, after the fact as a recording, make sure to add your own questions and comments in the feed because I'll be looking at those and I'd love to continue the discussion there. And make sure to add your own reactions, your likes, or whatever, whatever you've got as well, because I will be looking at the video later too and hope to continue with you guys. So before I get into really the shadow work that I want to do with you all tonight, just want to share a little bit about how I got to this work. Most of you know me as a shadow worker, which means that I help people to see, uncover, heal their own conditioning, their family conditioning, their cultural conditioning, with the goal of helping them to expand into their most authentic selves, their most empathic, compassionate selves, and their selves that can relate in an intimate and genuine way with other people. So one of the reasons, this is a very obvious, one of the reasons that internal anti-racism dovetails so well with shadow work, it is shadow work, is that especially if you're a white person, we've grown up in this stew, in this cultural stew. Actually, not just if you're white, no matter what the color of your skin is. If you are an American, for example, you've grown up being socialized in a way that is racist. And so let me define racism a little bit for you. My favorite definition of racism, I'll be sharing a lot of resources tonight that help me, but my favorite definition, grab the book here, is from Ijeoma Oluo. So you want to talk about race. This is a recent book that came out and she's based in Seattle. Her definition of racism is the following, and I have my notes here. She says, racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race when those views are reinforced by systems of power. So when I talk about racism today, I'm not talking about individual racist people. I'm not talking about bigots. I'm not talking about the bad apples or, our uncle or grandpa or other, person we're associated with who has racist beliefs. That's not what I'm talking about. So the goal, when I talk about promoting social justice and anti-racism, I'm not talking about winning the hearts and minds of those individual people. I'm talking about what we can do within ourselves to dive deep and heal our own socialization, which is racist, so that we can contribute to dismantling systemic racism. And by what I mean by systemic racism is the systems of power that have been in place for many hundreds of years, if not, you count thousands of years, because of colonialism by white people. And because white people, this is a gross oversimplification. Of course, it's Facebook Live. It's not like a 10-week class. But because of the power that white people have held for all of these hundreds of years, through the generations have been passed very unconsciously, just these notions, ways of socializing that are based in white superiority. And it's not necessarily, especially these days, that it's not necessarily that people consciously believe that whites are superior. Like some of our families are very progressive and have done their best to educate us for sure, but that doesn't change the fact that we grow up, especially if we're white, but really everyone, in this stew that is this basically this colonialism passed down and has had effects in how we're educated, the way that history is taught to us, the history of white people, the way that that education works, and what percentage of people who get a certain degree are of what color, how many teachers we have that look like us, how many people in power there are that look like us, whether or not our ancestors were enslaved, whether or not our ancestors were free and thus could develop capital that they could then pass along to us, and so forth. So to go back to my goal for today, I don't plan on making this a super long Facebook Live, but my goal for today is very simple, and that is to open a can of worms. I want to open the can of worms for your own further exploration of your own personal internalized racist tendencies, which we all have. Again, no matter how awesome we think our socialization was, we still live in the same culture. So I want to open that can of worms, get you curious and interested about how you might be living, saying things, believing in these ways with these unconscious values, and just to increase the personal awareness and also to point to resources that have really helped me on this path. And the payoff for doing this work of going within, of seeing where we personally perpetuate these power differences, is heart expansion. So I can tell you that since I've been doing this work for the past several years and very intensively recently, I feel like my capacity for compassion has increased exponentially. My feelings of racial tension when I'm around people of color, especially African Americans, has decreased significantly. And I feel like because I've chosen to really look at the suffering of people who are different from me, my natural human compassion has been set afire and is just alight and beautiful, and there's just no way to say it. You have to experience it for yourself. But it's really, if we value oneness, if we value equality, if we value justice, if we value love, then doing this work is really essential, and you're going to find that your heart just gets bigger and bigger, even though it's not easy, especially as a white person, to take a look and see the ways that we've internalized these structures in ourselves. So that's the shadow work of it. And it's vital because like a basic principle of shadow work is that what is unconscious within us, that which stays unconscious, ends up controlling us. That of which we're unconscious controls us. And a basic example of that in this context would be, let's say that I don't see race. I decide that, I don't see color. I'm going to not be aware of this person's race, and I end up saying something offhand to make conversation that ends up being offensive, or I'm making an assumption about somebody without realizing it, and then I deny it. That continues that system, the power system that is racism that we have. So there's so many benefits to doing this work, and especially as a white person, it is difficult, right? But also I find that going through this especially initial phase of a lot of difficulty, I mean, it's a continual process. This kind of work is lifelong, but there is an initial phase where, as a white person, where we see our whiteness for the first time, where we really break down for the first time. It's kind of like a gauntlet where you go through and you become aware of a lot very quickly. At least that's the way it was for me. After you go through that initial gauntlet, and again, this is just my experience, but it gets easier. And I just find that my heart is just so much more willing to be there for people unlike myself, even across, like, not just of different races, but really across differences. It's really about coming out of that denial, coming out of the illusion that we have that we as white people own normalcy, that we are just human as opposed to having race, and thus that we can begin to see our own way that we perpetuate the systems that are in place in order to change them. So I want to give you guys some associations, just some free associations. This is like a little exercise for you to do to get curious about how you might be internalizing this racism in yourself. So I'd like you to just listen to this list and in your head name a proper noun. So the actual name of a real person, like the first person that comes into your head. So the first is a wildly successful person, a wealthy person, a beautiful celebrity, a powerful person, an Academy Award winning actor or actress, an American cultural icon, a fashion icon. You might not know that. Someone who's creating the future now. So I just want you to take stock for yourself of how many people on that list are white that you just named. And the purpose of that exercise is to reveal your own cultural conditioning, how white supremacy is within you as well. And let me give you another set of exercises to do, another set of free associations. And this time, don't worry about naming a proper noun, an actual person. Just imagine what this person might look like in your mind. Just imagine how they look. So, the principal of a school, a teacher, a hired landscaper, a doctor, a sexy lingerie model, a successful politician, a college professor, a lawyer, a surgeon, a maid, a janitor, a famous writer of English literature, a genius, a family in the good old days. So think to yourself how many of those people you imagined were whites. There were just a few professions that I named that were not positions of power. That is a hired landscaper, a maid, a janitor. I think I said that one. And I wonder when you imagine that for yourself, if those were people of color or if those are white people. So again, that's just another way to free associate and reveal what your subconscious programming is when we immediately allow that imagination to come to mind. And for most people, I feel safe saying, regardless of skin color, those positions, especially the ones that carry a lot of power, will all look like white people. And so even if we don't believe that we are racist, you know, because most of us define racism as like an individual racist, like somebody intentionally saying something prejudiced to a person of color, even though, you know, we might not be that, even though we might not be intentionally harming anyone, because we do hold those subconscious assumptions that white people hold power, that's going to control our daily reality in ways that we're very unconscious of. So this work is really so mysterious and rewarding. And like I said before, heart expanding. I have another list that I want to read, and this one is from this book, Uprooting Racism. And it's by Paul Kivel, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. And this is the one that my teacher, Latasha Levy, gave to me. So when I'm going to read this list, I'll just read a few. It's a long list, but I don't want to make this live too long. So I'm going to read sets of 2 different terms, descriptions, and just imagine for yourself which one of the 2 you associate more with white people. So for example, just to read the first one as an example, pagan, Christian. Which one do you associate more with white people? So I'll just read the list, and for yourself, just imagine which one you associate more with white people. Godless, wholesome. Primitive, civilized. Superstitious, scientific. Less than human, human. Abnormal, normal. Emotional, calm. Rude, polite. Impulsive, thoughtful, and rational. Present time oriented, future oriented. Low class, middle class. Undignified, respectable. Sexual and chaste. Intellectually inferior, intelligent. Impatient, patient. So when I first read that list, it really made it very clear my own implicit bias. And that is another word for internalized racism, is implicit bias. So we all carry these within us. So I want to give you guys a few resources just going forward here if you want to take this work to the next level. I'm just reading my notes here. One of the quotes that I make sure I want to share here is one by Cornel West. And I believe he's at Harvard. I think he's a Harvard professor. I could be wrong, or he could have moved institutions. But Cornel West says, justice is love in action. So when we work on social justice within ourselves, we're really just working on bringing more love into the world. So the resources I want to point you to are, number one, I think one of the most powerful ways to work through this is a workbook called White Supremacy and Me. It's by Layla Saad, Layla Saad. You can just Google the White Supremacy and Me handbook. And she is famous for doing this Instagram 28-day White Supremacy and Me challenge, where every day she gave a journaling prompt for white people to journal on, for example, your privilege. And there's very specific questions she asks for each of these topics, like privilege, tone policing, white silence, topics like that, one a day for 28 days. And so you can get this whole 28-day challenge in the form of a workbook on her website. It's totally free. It's very powerful shadow work. It'll bring a lot to the surface. And so that's my number one suggestion. I just recently took an amazing online class from Dr. Latasha Levy, and she is a professor of Black Studies at University of Washington, and her class is called Woke 101 and Beyond. And it's just really opened my eyes, and it's such a rich dive into Black history, into racism and anti-racist movements, both by Blacks and whites in this country. And her approach is just so filled with compassion. And she's going to be offering another class in February. So her website is blackstarrising, I believe, .com. And again, especially for white people, this book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo, she's also from Seattle, is an absolute must. This book is so impactful. She invented the term white fragility, as far as I know. And I mentioned the Ijeoma Oluo book, So You Want to Talk About Race. She does a great job of just really simplifying these concepts, putting it into layman's terms. Uprooting Racism, like I showed before, is a really great, more of a textbook option for simplifying the terms that are used in social justice work. And then I am just diving into this one myself, but my teacher, Dr. Levy, sent me this one. It's a classic by Beverly Tatum. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she's a psychologist, so she offers a really unique perspective and compassionate perspective on anti-racism. And there are so many others I could name, but I don't want to overwhelm you guys. So thank you so much for tuning in, and please continue this discussion on the comments. If you have any specific situations or concerns that you're working with. I know that, so I was really brought to this work. I was woken up to this work a few years ago when I found myself asking a really ignorant question to one of my grad school colleagues, a cohort member who was Black, and I saw that she was wearing a pendant of the continent of Africa. And I looked at her pendant and I said, like, oh, you know, do you associate with any country in particular in Africa? And she said, no, you know, I don't really know where my ancestors are from. And in that moment, I felt this kind of a shock go through my body, or like an aha, like, oh God, like, of course not. And out of my anxiety, without thinking about it, I made this comment and I said, like, wow, that must be a really unusual experience. And then she very patiently and calmly said, well, actually, it's not an unusual experience. You know, a lot of people who I know don't know where their ancestors are from, especially if they're from Africa, if the ancestors were from Africa. And I just felt like the lowest of the low at that point. And the next day I came back and I asked for forgiveness. And but it was definitely a wake-up call for me that made me want to do intensive work on myself, because that comment revealed that I had a lot of unconscious biases. Even for me, somebody who already had a graduate degree, somebody who was a former academic, who was a teacher of African-American dance forms for many years, and whose mother was a jazz pianist who had an African-American teacher who was, you know, in our house and who shared stories of his race experiences with racism. Like, I didn't consider myself a particularly ignorant person, but it was revealed to me that there was still a lot in my subconscious that was, and that I wanted to explore and that I wanted to shift. So hopefully this work will help you all too, to just know yourselves better and to contribute to the justice and love in the world, to see people who look different from you with greater compassion and depth and complexity. So thank you for tuning in, and I'm going to sign out. Look forward to any of your questions. Bye, everyone.